You've been told that Canada is polite, safe, and slightly boring, in a wholesome way. That small towns are cozy, friendly places where nothing bad ever happens, and the scariest thing you'll encounter is an early closing time. That creepy places exist in horror movies, not in a country known for niceness and maple leaves. Reality disagrees. There are towns across Canada where something feels deeply off the moment you arrive. Places locals warn you not to stop in, not to ask questions, and definitely not to stay after dark. Towns shaped by tragedy, abandonment, economic collapse, strange histories, and atmospheres so unsettling they don't need jump scares to make your instincts scream, "Leave!" Today we're counting down the creepiest towns in Canada. The ones tourism ads will never mention, but locals quietly wish you'd stay away from. So subscribe and let's start! Number 18. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. Radioactive ghost town with post-apocalyptic atmosphere. Uranium City sits in remote northwestern Saskatchewan with population collapsed from 2,500 during uranium boom to approximately 70 today, creating literal ghost town, where abandoned buildings vastly outnumber occupied structures, and walking through feels like exploring post-apocalyptic wasteland where civilization briefly flourished, then collapsed catastrophically, leaving behind ruins that nature slowly reclaims, while remaining residents survive in decay that surrounds them, creating atmosphere that's profoundly unsettling even before considering radioactive contamination from decades of uranium mining that adds invisible threat to visible abandonment, making Uranium City genuinely creepy location that locals warn outsiders to avoid. According to population data and visitor accounts, Uranium City's abandoned buildings include schools, hospitals, hotels, and houses that sit empty and deteriorating with windows broken, doors hanging open, interiors exposed to weather and vandalism, creating scenes that horror movies would use as settings, but that represent real community where people once lived normal lives before economic collapse forced mass exodus, leaving behind infrastructure designed for thousands, now serving dozens, creating surreal landscape where abandoned outnumbers occupied 10 to 1 or more. The radioactive contamination from uranium mining operations that ran without adequate environmental controls creates invisible menace beneath visible abandonment, with soil and water containing elevated radiation and heavy metals that environmental assessments documented, but that remediation hasn't fully addressed, meaning that exploring Uranium City involves exposure risks that add genuine health hazards to atmospheric creepiness that abandoned buildings create, making location dangerous physically beyond just being unsettling psychologically. The isolation is extreme, with Uranium City being accessible only by expensive flights or winter ice roads that operate briefly when conditions permit, creating imprisonment where visitors who arrive when weather prevents flights may be stuck for days or weeks in decaying ghost town with minimal services, and remaining residents who may or may not be welcoming to outsiders wandering through ruins of community that collapse, traumatized population who remain, creating social tensions that add human threat to environmental hazards and atmospheric dread. According to the handful of people who remain, Uranium City attracts occasional urban explorers, photographers documenting decay, and curious visitors drawn by ghost town reputation. But locals generally discourage tourism because abandoned buildings are dangerous from structural deterioration, radioactive contamination creates health risks, isolation means help isn't available if accidents occur, and remaining residents prefer being left alone rather than hosting streams of visitors, treating their traumatic reality as adventure tourism opportunity. The creepy factor includes visual impact of abandoned infrastructure, invisible radioactive threat, extreme isolation creating vulnerability, remaining residents who may be hostile to visitors, predatory wildlife including bears that wander through abandoned buildings seeking food, and general atmosphere where human ambitions met catastrophic failure, leaving landscape that feels cursed or condemned through forces that capitalism and environmental negligence unleashed, then abandoned, creating ruins that serve as monuments to hubris and neglect. Number 17. Barkerville, British Columbia. Gold Rush town, frozen in time as living museum. Barkerville sits in east central BC as provincial heritage site, preserving Gold Rush town from 1860s with costumed interpreters and historical buildings, creating living museum that's charming during operating hours, but becomes genuinely creepy when crowds leave and darkness falls, transforming tourist attraction into abandoned feeling historical settlement where echoes of violent Gold Rush past seem to linger, and where overnight guests report unexplained sounds, shadow figures, and general sense of being watched by presences that rationalists dismiss, but that enough people experience to create reputation as haunted location. According to BC Parks Canada documentation and historical records, Barkerville during Gold Rush era was rough, violent place where men seeking fortunes lived in harsh conditions, Disputes were settled with violence, deaths from disease and accidents were common, and general atmosphere was desperate and dangerous as people pursued wealth in remote location where law enforcement was minimal and survival required toughness that modern tourists visiting sanitized historical recreation don't experience or understand when they treat Barkerville as charming educational destination. The creepy reports from overnight guests staying in heritage buildings include footsteps when nobody visible is walking, doors opening and closing without explanation, shadow figures glimpsed peripherally that vanish when looked at directly, unexplained cold spots in buildings that heating should warm uniformly, voices or music when all visitors and staff have left for night, and general sense of being watched or followed that makes people uncomfortable staying alone in buildings after dark. According to paranormal investigators and visitors who've experienced phenomena, Barkerville's combination of preserved buildings from violent era, tragic history of suffering and death, and isolation when tourist hours end creates conditions that skeptics attribute to imagination, while believers consider genuine haunting where residual energies or conscious spirits from Gold Rush era remain in location where their lives ended often tragically, creating manifestations that some people are sensitive to experiencing, while others detect nothing unusual beyond historical atmosphere. The creepy factor during tourist hours is minimal when crowds and costumed interpreters create festive educational environment, but after 5 p.m. when last visitors leave and staff depart leaving heritage buildings empty and dark, atmosphere shifts to isolated historical settlement where modern amenities are absent, shadows lengthen, forest surrounds buildings creating claustrophobic feeling, and general sense emerges that you're trespassing in space where past refuses to stay dead, making Barkerville creepier at night than marketing materials suggesting family-friendly historical attraction would lead people to expect. Number 16, Three Hills, Alberta, prairie town with eerie abandonment. Despite being inhabited, Three Hills sits in southern Alberta with population around 3,500 people, but atmosphere that feels significantly more abandoned and desolate than numbers suggest, creating eerie disconnect where town technically functions with residents and businesses, but general vibe is dying or already dead, creating creepiness through subtle wrongness where things seem normal superficially, but underlying current of decay and desperation makes visitors uncomfortable in ways they struggle to articulate beyond feeling that Three Hills is place. They shouldn't linger longer than necessary to get gas and leave quickly. According to visitor accounts and social media descriptions from people passing through, Three Hills creates unsettling impression through combination of economic decline visible in boarded storefronts and deteriorating buildings, isolation on prairie landscape where emptiness extends in all directions creating exposure and vulnerability, conservative religious atmosphere from Prairie Bible Institute that dominated community, historically creating cultural insularity that makes outsiders feel unwelcome, and general energy that residents describe as oppressive or stuck creating malaise affecting everyone living in economic stagnation. The downtown core shows visible economic decline with vacancy rates that appear high based on empty storefronts, businesses that seem barely surviving rather than thriving, infrastructure that's aging without adequate maintenance visible in cracked pavement and deteriorating buildings, and general atmosphere of community that's slowly dying but hasn't acknowledged or accepted reality creating cognitive dissonance between maintaining normal appearances and underlying decay that everyone sees but nobody openly discusses. The isolation on prairie landscape contributes to creepiness through exposure, where Three Hills sits on flat agricultural land with minimal trees and long sightlines, creating feeling of vulnerability and nowhere to hide if threat emerges, combined with cultural conservatism that makes the few visible people seem suspicious of outsiders, particularly those who don't fit conservative Christian demographic that Prairie Bible Institute attracted historically, creating social environment where visitors feel scrutinized and unwelcome even when interactions are technically polite. Number 15, Centralia, Ontario, underground coal fire burning. Since 1880s, Centralia sits in southwestern Ontario near Modern Highway, where few people realize that underground coal seam fire has burned continuously since 1880s when mine fires started and couldn't be extinguished, creating situation where ground above fire zone periodically vents steam and heat, making soil too hot to touch in certain locations, sinkholes open without warning when underground combustion collapses, surface creating danger and general atmosphere where invisible fire burning beneath your feet creates primal unease that rational knowledge of geological phenomena doesn't entirely eliminate even when you understand the science. According to geological surveys and historical records, Centralia coal seam fire ignited in 1880s during mining operations, and despite efforts to extinguish through flooding and other methods, continued burning underground, fueled by coal deposits that extend through region, creating persistent fire that will continue until coal is exhausted, which geological estimates suggest could take another century or more, meaning fire has been burning over 140 years and will continue for foreseeable future. The visible evidence of underground fire includes vents where steam and smoke escape, creating columns of vapor that are visible particularly in cold weather when contrast makes exhalations obvious. Soil that's hot to touch above fire zones, creating danger of burns if people walk on surface without awareness. Sinkholes that open periodically when underground combustion collapses. Cavities creating sudden drops that could trap or injure unwary visitors. And dead vegetation where heat kills plant life, creating bare patches in otherwise green landscape. The creepy factor comes from knowing that beneath your feet, coal is burning in seams that extend underground in patterns that mapping has documented, but that surface appearances don't reveal, creating unsettling awareness that ground you're standing on may be undermined by fire or could collapse into sinkhole without warning if you're standing above cavity that combustion created, making Centralia location where visible surface safety is illusion and invisible danger lurks literally beneath every step. The historical context includes mine deaths from original fire in 1880s, environmental damage from century plus of underground combustion, and failed attempts to extinguish fire that cost substantial sums without success, creating legacy of human ambition meeting geological reality that couldn't be controlled through technology or will, leaving eternal fire as monument to limits of human power over natural forces that we unleash without fully understanding or controlling consequences. Number 14. Craigellachie, BC, last spike location. With eerie isolation. Craigellachie sits in interior BC at location where Canadian Pacific Railway's last spike was driven, completing Transcontinental Railway in 1885. Creating a historically significant site that's now isolated waypoint where few people stop, and those who do often report feeling watched or uncomfortable despite beautiful mountain scenery surrounding small memorial commemorating engineering achievement that united Canada physically, while Indigenous displacement and Chinese worker exploitation created dark legacy beneath celebratory official history. According to historical records and memorial information, Craigellachie last spike ceremony excluded Chinese workers who built railway through deadly mountain conditions while being paid less than white workers and facing discrimination that Canadian history often downplays when celebrating railway achievement, creating historical injustice that some visitors sense when standing at site where official commemoration ignores suffering that accomplishment required, making location feel haunted by silenced voices whose contributions were erased from triumphant narratives. The isolation is notable, with Craigellachie being basically just memorial marker and handful of buildings along highway, where traffic is moderate but community is minimal, creating exposure on mountain landscape where beauty is undeniable but atmosphere feels empty and melancholic, as though location carries weight of history that monuments can't fully address or resolve, when systemic injustices underlying achievement remain unacknowledged or minimized by narratives prioritizing celebration over truth-telling about costs that progress demanded. The creepy reports from visitors include feeling watched when nobody visible is around, sense of sadness or oppression that beautiful scenery doesn't explain, unexplained cold spots or temperature drops that mountain weather doesn't account for, and general discomfort that makes people want to leave quickly rather than lingering to appreciate scenery or contemplate history, creating reputation among sensitive visitors as location that's disturbing rather than merely commemorative. Like this video if you're fascinated by Canada's creepy, unsettling locations that challenge polite, friendly national reputation. Subscribe if you want to explore dark atmospheric places where histories, isolation, or unexplained phenomena create environments that locals warn against visiting. And share this with anyone interested in Canada's stranger, more unsettling realities that tourism marketing deliberately conceals. Number 13. The Pas, Manitoba, high crime town with unsettling atmosphere. The Pas sits in northwestern Manitoba with population around 5,000 people and reputation as one of Manitoba's most dangerous communities, with violent crime rates substantially exceeding provincial and national averages, creating atmosphere where locals warn visitors not to walk alone after dark. Gas station attendants tell travelers to fill up and leave rather than staying overnight. And general sense of menace pervades, particularly in downtown areas where visible social problems, including substance abuse and poverty, create environment that feels threatening even during daylight hours to people unaccustomed to communities where desperation and violence are normalized. According to Statistics Canada crime data, the Pas has crime severity index scores that regularly exceed 150 compared to national average of 75, violent crime rates that are more than double provincial averages, and assault rates that Statistics Canada data shows are among Manitoba's highest, creating statistical reality behind atmospheric unease that visitors report when passing through a community where visible poverty, substance abuse, and general social disorder make threat feel immediate rather than abstract. The downtown area shows visible signs of economic decline and social problems with boarded storefronts, deteriorating buildings, groups of people who appear intoxicated or high gathered in public spaces during daytime hours creating intimidating atmosphere, businesses that operate behind security barriers, suggesting crime is common enough that protection is necessary, and general environment where normal commercial activity seems minimal while underground or informal economies appear to dominate based on visible indicators. According to theories about why the pass has become so dangerous, contributing factors include economic decline from resource industry changes eliminating employment, geographic isolation creating limited opportunities for people to leave even when conditions are bad, substance abuse epidemics including opioids affecting substantial portions of population, inadequate policing and social services that funding limitations prevent from addressing problems at scale required, and racial tensions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, creating conflicts that violence sometimes emerges from when systemic injustices and immediate economic desperation combine. The creepy factor isn't supernatural, but rather emerges from dangerous human environment where poverty, addiction, and violence create threat that's real rather than imagined, making the past creepy through menace that comes from social breakdown and desperation rather than ghosts or mysteries, which arguably makes it more disturbing because danger is immediate and human rather than paranormal and debatable. Number 12. Flin, Manitoba, mining town with toxic legacy and eerie landscape. Flin sits on Manitoba-Saskatchewan border with population around 5,000 people and landscape scarred by decades of mining, creating eerie industrial wasteland where tailings piles dominate skyline, contaminated lakes warn against swimming or consuming fish, smelter emissions historically polluted air and soil with heavy metals, creating health concerns that residents accept or ignore, and general atmosphere combines economic decline with environmental degradation, creating visibly damaged landscape that looks post-apocalyptic, particularly in areas closest to mining operations where vegetation is sparse and earth is stained colors that nature didn't create. According to environmental assessments and health studies, Flin area shows elevated levels of heavy metals including arsenic, lead, copper, and other contaminants in soil and water from decades of mining and smelting operations that environmental regulations didn't adequately control, creating legacy that cleanup efforts have partially addressed but haven't fully resolved, meaning residents continue living with contamination that long-term health impacts are uncertain, but concerning, particularly for children whose developing bodies are more vulnerable to environmental toxins. The visual landscape includes massive tailings, piles that are artificial mountains created from mining waste, lakes that are visibly contaminated with discoloration and warning signs prohibiting swimming or fishing, vegetation that's stunted or absent in areas where soil contamination is severe, and general scarring where industrial operations transformed natural landscape into damaged environment that recovery will take decades or centuries to restore, if restoration is even possible when contamination is severe and persistent. The creepy factor comes from visible environmental damage creating landscapes that look alien or wrong with colors and textures that nature alone wouldn't produce. Knowledge that soil and water contain toxins making environment actively harmful to human health, creating invisible threat beneath visible damage, and general sense that human industrial activity caused damage that can't be undone, creating permanent sacrifice zones where land has been ruined for short-term economic gain that enriched corporations while leaving communities to live with toxic legacy. The health concerns include elevated cancer rates that some attribute to environmental contamination, though proving causation is difficult, respiratory issues from historical air pollution that smelter emissions created, and general anxiety about long-term exposure. Effects that uncertainty makes worse because you can't see or taste contaminants that bioaccumulate in bodies over time, creating damage that manifests years or decades after exposure when connecting health problems to historical environmental causes becomes statistically challenging. Number 11. Churchill, Manitoba, polar bear town with isolation and climate extremes. Churchill sits on Hudson Bay coast with population around 900 people and reputation as polar bear capital, creating tourism draw that obscures creepier realities including extreme isolation, accessible only by expensive flights or summer train, creating imprisonment when weather prevents travel, polar bears that regularly enter town creating genuine danger, requiring armed patrols and resident vigilance, climate extremes that test human endurance through brutal cold and extended darkness, and general atmosphere where you're acutely aware of being at edge of human habitability, an environment that could kill you quickly if systems fail or you make mistakes. According to wildlife management data and public safety information, Churchill experiences regular polar bear incursions where animals enter town searching for food, creating dangerous situations that conservation officers manage through patrols, deterrence, and if necessary lethal removal when bears can't be scared away, making Churchill a location where apex predators are genuine threat rather than abstract concern, and where residents live with awareness that wildlife encounters could be fatal if proper precautions aren't followed. The isolation creates creepy vulnerability where Churchill is accessible only by flights that weather can cancel, or summer train that doesn't operate year-round, meaning medical emergencies or urgent situations requiring evacuation may be delayed by transportation limitations, creating risk that help isn't available when needed. Making Churchill a location where you're on your own, beyond what local resources can provide, and where serious problems could be fatal, because distance and weather prevent timely assistance. The climate is Arctic, brutal with winter temperatures regularly dropping to -40 or colder, extended darkness during polar night creating psychological stress that affects most people to varying degrees, requiring conscious strategies for maintaining mental health, and general environmental extremes that make surviving require constant vigilance about proper clothing, heating, and awareness. That exposure kills quickly when temperature and wind combine to create conditions that human bodies can't withstand without protection. According to visitors and even some residents, Churchill atmosphere oscillates between fascinating frontier adventure when weather is clear and tourism brings crowds, to genuinely creepy isolation when storms close airport, and winter darkness makes town feel trapped at edge of inhabitable world where humans exist on sufferance of environment that tolerates us barely, creating psychological impacts that seasonal affective disorder and isolation compound into depression that affects many people spending extended time in location. Number 10. Uranium City, Saskatchewan, revisited for deeper exploration of abandonment. Trauma. Uranium City merits second entry for deeper exploration of psychological impacts that abandonment creates, because walking through ghost town where population collapsed from 2,500 to 70 creates a visceral experience of civilizational failure that's profoundly unsettling beyond initial shock of seeing abandoned buildings, revealing how prolonged exposure to decay and emptiness affects psyche through confronting evidence that human communities can simply end when economic rationales disappear and populations evacuate, leaving behind infrastructure that rots back into landscape. According to psychological research on abandoned places and trauma, exposure to extensive urban decay creates documented stress responses including anxiety, depression, and existential dread because abandoned environments trigger evolutionary responses to danger and wrongness that brains interpret as threat signals even when no immediate physical danger exists, making Uranium City psychologically disturbing through prolonged exposure to evidence that human efforts can fail completely, leaving ruins as monuments to futility. The remaining 70 residents living amid abandonment experience isolation and psychological burden that outsiders visiting briefly don't fully comprehend, because daily life surrounded by empty buildings that once housed neighbors and served community creates constant reminder of loss and failure that many find depressing or traumatic, particularly when they remain because limited options or attachments prevent leaving, even when staying means enduring environment that's fundamentally melancholic and oppressive. Number 9. Elliot Lake, Ontario, uranium mining, town attempting reinvention after collapse. Elliot Lake sits in northern Ontario with population around 11,000 down from peak of 18,000, experiencing creepiness through attempted reinvention as retirement community after uranium mine closures in 90s caused population crash, creating atmosphere where town markets itself as affordable, peaceful destination while underlying reality is aging, deteriorating infrastructure, shopping mall roof, collapse in 2012 killing 2 people, revealed maintenance failures and municipal dysfunction, and general sense that community is slowly dying despite marketing rhetoric claiming otherwise. According to population data and economic analyses, Elliot Lake lost nearly half its population when mines closed, forcing mass exodus, then attempted reinvention by marketing to retirees seeking affordable living, attracting seniors on fixed incomes, but failing to create economic base supporting community long-term, because retirement-focused economy doesn't generate wealth or opportunities, attracting younger families whose presence would create demographic balance and economic vitality. The mall collapse in June 2012 killed 2 people when roof collapsed during business hours, trapping victims in rubble and revealing that building maintenance had been deferred and warning signs ignored, creating scandal that investigations exposed corruption and incompetence in municipal government and building management, creating betrayal that residents felt when authorities failed to protect public safety, making Elliot Lake creepy through knowledge that institutional failures caused preventable deaths. According to long-term residents and social observers, Elliot Lake feels increasingly like hospice community where people come to live out final years in affordability, but where cultural and economic life is minimal because retiree population doesn't create demand for services, amenities, or activities that younger, diverse populations support, making town feel like waiting room where people exist rather than live, creating depressing atmosphere that marketing can't conceal from visitors who see beyond promotional materials to underlying reality. Number 8. Port Radium NWT, abandoned mining town. With radioactive legacy and indigenous tragedy, Port Radium sits on Great Bear Lake shore as abandoned settlement where uranium was mined during World War II for Manhattan Project, without adequate safety precautions, killing and sickening Dean workers who transported ore without protection from radiation exposure, creating toxic legacy and historical injustice where indigenous people suffered and died contributing to atomic weapons development without informed consent or compensation, while mine operators and governments profited from their labor and exposure, making Port Radium creepy through combination of radioactive contamination and historical atrocity. According to historical research and indigenous testimony, Dean workers at Port Radium and along transportation routes where they carried uranium ore on their backs or in boats were not informed about radiation hazards and developed cancers and other illnesses from exposure that mine operators and government officials knew was dangerous but allowed to continue because cheap indigenous labor was expendable in pursuit of military objectives and corporate profits that prevailed over worker safety and informed consent. The radioactive contamination persists in Great Bear Lake where mine tailings leached into watershed, in soil where processing occurred and waste was dumped, and in buildings that were abandoned when operations ceased, leaving radioactive materials behind that remediation efforts have partially addressed but not fully resolved, creating invisible environmental hazard that combines with visible abandonment to make Port Radium location that environmental and historical reasons suggest avoiding. The historical injustice where Dean workers died horrible deaths from radiation exposure while their communities were told nothing about hazards and received no compensation until decades later when survivors organized and demanded recognition creates moral weight that location carries, making Port Radium creepy not just through physical contamination but through knowledge that human beings were deliberately exposed to fatal hazards by authorities who valued their lives as worthless compared to military and economic objectives. The creepy factor is profound because Port Radium embodies multiple horrors, including radioactive contamination making environment dangerous, historical atrocity where people were deliberately exposed to fatal hazards, abandonment and decay creating visual wasteland, and isolation making location feel cursed or condemned through forces that human evil and environmental destruction unleashed, creating place that indigenous people and others familiar with history describe as spiritually heavy or wrong, because of suffering and injustice that occurred there. Number 7. Waterton Lakes. Town site, Alberta, evacuated after wildfire, with uncertain future. Waterton Lakes sits in southwestern Alberta as town site within National Park that Keno wildfire devastated in September 2017, burning many buildings and traumatizing community that evacuated hastily as flames approached, creating eerie atmosphere where town that was evacuated en masse then partially rebuilt still feels haunted by trauma and uncertainty about future when another fire could force evacuation again, making Waterton creepy through recent catastrophe and awareness that returning residents live with vulnerability, that climate change makes worse through increasing wildfire frequency. According to Parks Canada data and wildfire reports, Keno fire burned approximately 19,000 hectares, including significant portions of Waterton town site where buildings were destroyed or damaged, entire population evacuated by boat across lake or by vehicle before fire-blocked roads, and general trauma occurred from losing homes and businesses, plus uncertainty about whether town would be rebuilt or abandoned, creating crisis that reconstruction partially resolved but didn't eliminate because fire risk remains. The rebuilt town site feels different according to residents who returned, because buildings that burned were replaced with new structures that lack history and character that original buildings possessed. Neighbors who didn't return left holes in community fabric that newcomers haven't filled, creating sense of loss and disruption and general awareness that another fire could destroy everything. Again makes enjoying present moment difficult when future feels precarious, creating anxiety that affects daily life. The creepy atmosphere comes from combination of recent trauma that residents carry. Visible evidence where burned foundations and scarred landscape remind everyone of catastrophe, uncertainty about future, when climate change projections suggest fires will become more frequent and severe, making Waterton an increasingly risky place to invest and live, and general sense that community is living on borrowed time until next evacuation forces decisions about whether to keep rebuilding or finally abandon town site. Number 6. Dawson City, Yukon, Gold Rush Town. Preserving violent past, Dawson City sits in Yukon as heritage town, preserving Klondike Gold Rush history from 1890s, when thousands sought fortunes in harsh conditions where many died from disease, accidents, violence, and exposure, creating period of desperate treasure seeking that heritage buildings and costumed interpreters recreate during tourist season. But that turns genuinely creepy when winter darkness and isolation reveal that town preserving violent past sits at edge of inhabitable world where people still die from cold and where isolation creates vulnerability. According to historical records and gold rush documentation, Dawson City during boom years was a rough, violent place where men pursued wealth through brutal labor and freezing conditions. Disputes were settled with violence when law enforcement was minimal. Prostitution and gambling were ubiquitous, creating atmosphere of vice and exploitation. Deaths from scurvy and other diseases killed substantial numbers before supplies and medical care improved. And general desperation created an environment where human life was cheap and suffering was normalized. The heritage preservation recreates gold rush atmosphere during summer tourist season when visitors enjoy historical attractions and entertainment. But winter transforms Dawson City into isolated dark settlement where temperatures drop to -50. Darkness extends for most of 24 hours. Isolation is complete when Klondike Highway occasionally closes, and general sense emerges that you're living in outpost where survival requires vigilance and where help isn't available if emergencies occur, making vulnerability acute. The creepy reports from winter residents and visitors include sense that buildings preserve more than history, but also traumatic energies from gold rush violence and death. Unexplained phenomena in heritage buildings, where people died, including sounds, shadows, and temperature anomalies that skeptics dismiss, but enough people experience to create reputation as haunted location and general atmosphere during polar night, when darkness and cold create psychological stress that makes people more sensitive to perceptions that summer visitors miss. Number 5. Kitsault, BC, modern ghost town, abandoned in 80s. Kitsault sits on BC North Coast as modern ghost town abandoned in 1983 when molybdenum mine closed after 18 months of operation, leaving behind complete town of about 100 buildings, including houses, shopping center, recreation facilities, and infrastructure that was abandoned virtually overnight, creating time capsule frozen in 1980s. That's remarkably well preserved through caretaking but profoundly creepy through combination of modernity and abandonment, where microwave dinners sit in freezers and calendars show dates from 1983, creating eerie sense of interruption. According to documentation of Kitsault's history, the town was built rapidly in early 1980s to house workers at molybdenum mine that developers expected would operate for decades, creating boomtown that attracted families seeking employment and constructed complete modern community with every amenity, only to close abruptly when molybdenum prices crashed, making operation unprofitable, forcing immediate shutdown that gave residents minimal time to pack belongings and evacuate, leaving behind town that looks like people just left expecting to return tomorrow. The preserved state is remarkable because property owner has maintained buildings, preventing decay that usually consumes abandoned structures, creating situation where houses contain furniture and personal items that residents left behind. Shopping center has goods still on shelves, though outdated by decades. Recreation center has equipment ready to use, and general infrastructure remains functional, creating surreal environment where everything is ready for occupants who will never return, making Kitsault creepiest modern ghost town. The creepy factor is intense because modernity makes abandonment more jarring than historical ghost towns where decay and time create distance, whereas Kitsault's preservation creates feeling that residents could walk back in at any moment but won't, because economic forces that capitalism creates destroyed community that seemed permanent when built, but proved ephemeral when profits disappeared, making it monument to how quickly human communities can be created and destroyed by economic decisions beyond residents' control. According to visitors and urban explorers who've accessed Kitsault legally or through trespassing, walking through preserved abandoned town creates profound unease from disconnect between modernity and emptiness, where buildings that should contain people and activity sit silent and empty, creating wrongness that brain interprets as threatening even when no danger exists, making Kitsault psychologically disturbing through confronting evidence that human communities are fragile and can simply end. Number 4. Anyox, BC, smelter town. Destroyed by fire and abandoned, Anyox sits on BC north coast as abandoned smelter town that fire destroyed in 1942 after copper smelter closed in 1935, leaving skeleton population that fire then displaced completely, creating ghost town where ruins of industrial operations, houses, and infrastructure slowly decay in rainforest environment that's reclaiming site, creating eerie landscape where nature and abandonment combine to make Anyox genuinely creepy location that isolation makes difficult to access, but those who visit describe as profoundly unsettling. According to historical records, Anyox during peak operation housed thousands of workers at copper smelter that provided employment from 1914 to 1935 when ore deposits were exhausted, forcing closure that eliminated economic rationale for town's existence, reducing population to skeleton crew, maintaining infrastructure until fire in 1942, destroyed much of remaining town site, forcing final evacuation and complete abandonment. The ruins include substantial concrete foundations from smelter operations, mine infrastructure including tunnels and equipment that's rusting, house foundations and deteriorating structures being reclaimed by forest, and general industrial wasteland where environmental damage from smelting created toxic legacy visible in scarred landscape and contaminated soil that recovery will take centuries if vegetation can establish in damaged areas where pollutants persist. The creepy factor combines industrial decay creating post-apocalyptic landscape, environmental contamination making site dangerous, isolation creating vulnerability, forest reclaiming ruins creating sense of nature erasing human presence, and general atmosphere where failed industrial ambitions created damage, then abandoned leaving toxic legacy that communities downwind or downstream still experience through persistent environmental contamination. Subscribe if you're fascinated by Canada's creepiest locations where isolation. Number 3. Alert, Nunavut, northernmost settlement with extreme isolation and darkness. Alert sits on Ellesmere Island at 82 degrees north latitude, making it world's northernmost permanently inhabited location, with population fluctuating between 60 and 80 military personnel, and contractors operating weather station and signals intelligence facility, experiencing extreme isolation accessible only by military flights, polar night lasting 4 months, creating complete darkness. November through February, temperatures that regularly hit -50 making environment actively hostile, and general creepiness from being at absolute edge of human habitability, where mistakes or system failures could be fatal. According to Canadian Forces Documentation and Environment Canada information, Alert has no permanent civilian population, with all residents being military personnel or contractors on temporary postings lasting months before rotating south, creating transient population in location that feels like Mars base, where survival requires constant vigilance, and where isolation is so complete that psychological impacts are documented and managed through screening and support, because extended deployments at Alert create stress that affects everyone regardless of mental resilience. The polar night creates darkness lasting 4 months, where sun doesn't rise above horizon from late October through mid-February, creating psychological stress that seasonal affective disorder research documents as severe, with many people experiencing depression, sleep disruption, and general mental health impacts that vitamin D supplements and artificial lighting partially address, but don't fully prevent, because human circadian rhythms require some sunlight exposure for optimal functioning. The climate is Arctic extreme, with temperatures regularly dropping to -50 or colder during winter, wind chills that can reach -70 making exposed skin freeze in minutes, and general environmental hostility where going outside requires extensive preparations, because exposure quickly leads to frostbite and hypothermia that can be fatal if rescue isn't immediate, making Alert location where environment is constant threat rather than occasional hazard. Number 2. Attawapiskat, Ontario. Third world conditions creating social breakdown and desperation. Attawapiskat merits inclusion as creepy location not through supernatural claims, but through third world living conditions creating environment where poverty, overcrowding, infrastructure failures, substance abuse, and suicide crises create atmosphere of desperation and dysfunction that visitors describe as profoundly disturbing, and that locals warn outsiders not to visit, both because outsider presence is cultural intrusion and because social breakdown creates dangers that tourists shouldn't expose themselves to when community is experiencing crises that media coverage periodically exposes, but systemic solutions don't address. According to census data and crisis reports, Attawapiskat experiences housing overcrowding where 8 to 10 people share units built for 4, poverty rates exceeding 80%, unemployment over 50%, substance abuse affecting significant proportions of population creating visible public intoxication, youth suicide clusters that traumatize entire community when multiple young people kill themselves in short periods, and general social breakdown that third-world conditions create when people lose hope and systems fail to provide support, preventing complete collapse. The creepy atmosphere comes from visible human suffering, where poverty, addiction, and despair are omnipresent, creating an environment where everyone you see is either experiencing or witnessing trauma. Infrastructure failures make basic services unreliable, creating uncertainty about whether water is safe or sewage is functioning. Overcrowding makes privacy impossible, creating stress that mental health can't sustain, and general sense that community is experiencing slow-motion disaster that outside interventions temporarily address without resolving makes everything feel hopeless and heavy. Number 1. Highway of Tears. BC 16. Highway corridor where Indigenous women disappeared and died. Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert represents creepiest Canadian location, not through single town but through entire corridor where dozens of Indigenous women have disappeared or been found murdered since 1970, creating ongoing tragedy. That name, Highway of Tears, captures through grief and terror that families experience when relatives travel route and don't arrive, creating fears that authorities dismissed or minimized for decades, until pressure-forced investigations that confirmed serial predation occurring along isolated highway where Indigenous women were targeted by multiple killers over decades. According to official investigations and Indigenous organizations tracking cases, at least 18 Indigenous women and girls disappeared or were murdered along Highway 16 corridor between 1969 and 2011, with many additional cases that may be connected but weren't officially included in counts, creating death toll that would constitute serial killer crisis if victims were white women from Vancouver, but that attracted minimal attention or resources when victims were Indigenous, making racism and indifference factors allowing predation to continue. Subscribe if you liked it.